So we're going to look at a little bit in the book of Joel. So there's a promise in Joel chapter 2, verse 26 that says, "You will have plenty to eat until you are full." Just invite you to think about that very tangible nature of that statement. Have you thought about God's promises as they relate to hunger, as they relate to food and food security? God is speaking here about food and flourishing. He speaks this promise to Israel after a plague of locusts have completely destroyed all of their crops. In an agronomic society, can you imagine what that would be like, to have your entire food supply consumed? The Israelite nation here is facing a catastrophic destruction of their food and food supply and their future, and God is responding here. How would God's declaration of plenty in this context sound to the Israelite nation, do you think? This nation that's on the brink of famine, of total poverty, of devastation. How do you think this verse might speak to hungry people all over the world today? For millions of farmers in Africa, having plenty to eat for them and their families feels like an unattainable dream. It really does. What might God say to those who are food insecure today? People who have no idea where their next meal is coming from. How might God respond to the worldwide threat of hunger in our world?
So we have personally seen the impact of hunger in Africa and the response of God to alleviating hunger. Let me start with an experience in Ethiopia. This photo, go to the next photo. Yeah. This photo is of a small urban maize plot in Kombolcha. Kombolcha is a small mountain town in northern Ethiopia. It was actually one of the epicenters in the 1980s famine. And that sparked the whole Feed the World movement. And it's also an area that has been severely affected by armed conflict in recent years. This past November, we were in Kombolcha with the Ethiopia Farming God's Way team. From the balcony of our accommodation in the middle of town, I watched the sun rise over this small hidden garden every morning. Can you see it? There is field corn growing. We call it maize. And the maize is dwarfed by those metal houses, and there's actually was scaffolding of new construction all around this garden. It's really not an ideal place to grow food. That same week, at our 5-day training, our Farming God's Way training, we met a farmer who had struggled for years. His yields were declining, and he knew his soil was degrading. Season after season, the land produced less and less. And the only conclusion that he could come to was that his land was cursed. His neighbors even started to avoid him because he was cursed. Everyone encouraged him to give up on farming. When you see the soil producing less every year, what else do you conclude? So the question begins to form, is farming a blessing or a curse? The people in the communities we work with all over Africa are not lacking understanding. They are deeply attentive to their context. They observe carefully and they respond to what they see and experience. And most are grounded in an integrative worldview. The land, the body, and the spirit are all connected. So when the land begins to suffer, year after year, they do not see it as a random occurrence. They search for meaning. We were deeply impacted by the farmer in our training who carried this heaviness of believing that he was cursed. And then as I gazed upon this urban garden in Kombolcha, I also wondered, what is the story of this urban farmer? Why has he left his rural land to farm in town? Is he also trying to escape a curse? And how many more people are facing the same belief.
Kerry and I have been walking a journey in South Africa for the last 16 years. We've been learning and we've been teaching. We've been growing food in South Africa and teaching people to how to grow food in a way that builds fertility, restores the land and its people, is in alignment with God's very good creation, and multiplies yields and is also profitable. We're also farmers. This morning we want to share a bit of this journey with you, not through data or theory, but through 16 images, each image telling a story. Each is a snapshot of something that we've experienced, something we've learned, or something that has profoundly changed us. 16 years through 16 glimpses. And as you look at them, we invite you to ask the same questions that we've been asking. And here's one of them. Is growing food and caring for land, can we do that in a state of blessing, or is it a curse? So let's return for a moment to the time of the prophet Joel. Imagine this Israelite community in the Old Testament experiencing what many farming communities in Africa are facing today: land degradation, soil erosion, total crop failure, pests sweeping through fields that are nearly ready for harvest. In Joel, this is exactly what we find. So Joel chapter 1, starting at verse 10, says, "The fields are bare. The ground mourns because the grain is destroyed. The grapes are dried up, and the olive trees are withered. Grieve, you farmers." I think it was the first song that we sang this morning. There was a line in there about creation groaning, or the longing of creation. So here the Israelite people knew what it meant to watch the land fail them. And in that moment, what did they conclude? Is this a blessing or a curse? Joel doesn't ignore the question, but he also doesn't allow the story to end there. God doesn't let the story end there. He speaks here of a turning, a realignment, and then a restoration that's incredible to imagine. A day when people will eat until they are full. So then, skipping to Joel chapter 2, it says, "But even now, says the Lord, repent sincerely and return to me with fasting and weeping and mourning. Let your broken hearts show your sorrow. Tearing your clothes is not enough. Come back to the Lord your God. He is kind and full of mercy. He is patient and he keeps his promises. The threshing places will be full of grain. The pits beside the presses will overflow with wine and overflow. I'll give you back what you have lost in the years when swarms of locusts ate your crops. Now you will have plenty to eat and be satisfied until you are full. You will praise the Lord your God who has done wonderful things for you." It's an amazing piece of scripture in Joel. God is speaking of hope and restoration in a time of desperation. God's character is on display in a profound way. He wants the flourishing of the people and the flourishing of the land and the changing of hearts to all align. That's how he designed it from the beginning.
So let's rewind now to some moments that shaped our ministry journey. This photo was taken in Lesotho in 2011, just 1 year into our Farming God's Way journey. We were teaching layouts in this field after a significant training time with farmers. Dan actually received his Farming God's Way accreditation that week. It was a hot day and many of the group were sitting on the ground. Some of them took advantage of a natural step in the ground that was between the unplowed land and the plowed land. Can you see it? Our colleague Grant Dryden, he is in the yellow t-shirt, and his son is one of the only ones with blonde hair there. He's sitting with his legs perfectly bent on a natural step in the field. How big do you estimate that drop is in the field? It looks like over a foot. Okay, that step had formed over time because of plowing. As the soil lost its structure, it began to slump, and the field quickly compacted, losing all the natural and necessary space for air and water. The unplowed soil on the side remained the same at the original level. You should never have to step down into your field. The step reveals devastating erosion, which is one of Africa's greatest crises. For the farmers working this land, this was normal. They could see something was changing, but they did not understand why. Over time, this kind of degradation leads to crop failure. The soil becomes unable to sustain cultivation, and eventually there's a sense that farming itself is hopeless. Even for us, looking back, so this is 15 years ago, looking back at this image now, we are struck by how clearly the land was telling a story.
These maize cobs on the screen reflect what is possible. One seed planted, 2 or 3 cobs on a maize plant, and many hundreds of kernels on each cob, about 600 usually. From a single seed, much more than 1,000 seeds returned. This is how the land is designed to function. Not just survival, but multiplication and flourishing. Staple crops like this, like maize, matter because they can be stored for months as dry grain. They carry dense calories, they sustain life through the seasons. For an African family of average family of 6, that family needs about 1,250 kilograms of maize just to sustain life, to provide enough calories for the year. 1,250 kilograms. Just keep that number in mind. That's the minimum requirement. But under conventional methods, in other words, what most smallholder African farmers are doing, many farmers are producing only about 200 kilograms on an acre. And an acre is about the average size of a farm, smallholder farm in Africa. So 200 kilograms produced versus 1,250 kilograms needed. Let that sink in for a moment. That cosmic gap between what's needed and what the land produces. But when a farmer turns to start cultivating that land in alignment with God's good creation, we begin to see something completely different. Yields of more than 3,000 kilograms per acre become easily possible. Now we have overflow, production of 3,000 kilograms, more than providing for a family of what the family needs of 1,250 kilograms. Now there's more than enough.
So 3,000 kilograms is 60 large.
Yeah, so we use 50 kilogram bags to store grain in Africa. It's about that size. That's a 50 kg bag. So 3,000 kilograms is 60 of those. That's abundance.
Yeah, on 1 acre.
Dixon, who's a farmer friend of ours in Malawi, is now consistently getting over 90 bags on his acre of land. These harvests aren't just enough for subsistence. I don't even like that subsistence farming, just barely getting by. This is abundance, which is the heart of the Father. The difference isn't in the land or the soil. Dixon is farming the same acre that his father used to farm, and when his father farmed it, he would usually get between 2 and 4 bags on that acre in a season. The difference is how the land is cared for, and this is where the story shifts. So back to Joel chapter 2, after years of devastation, there's this promise of complete restoration. The land, the soil, begins to respond again. The harvest returns until there's more than enough, until people are full. It's a picture of flourishing in every way. This maize in the photo was grown at the Anando Model Farm that we live on and look after in South Africa. This is a glimpse of what happens when the land is restored and begins to give back what it was always designed to give. This is the beginning of overflow. And that word, inando, for the Anando Model Farm, that word means overflow. It's the Latin word from which we get our English word inundate, that flourishing, that overflow idea.
So now this was our beginning, August 2010, at the Seed of Hope Community Development Center in Bechuandle, South Africa. We gathered a small group and hosted a simple introductory training. For us, it marked the start of everything that would follow. At that time, Dan was the only Farming God's Way trainer in KwaZulu-Natal. It's one of the provinces in South Africa. He learned through online videos and available resources, and piece by piece, he would understand and put it all together and then start to implement in this small area. Further training would follow, and now many years of learning and implementation. This training was a beginning. It came at a time when communities were under immense pressure. The HIV pandemic was still deeply affecting families. Health, livelihoods, and food security were all under tremendous strain. We felt a clear call, not just to speak about hope, but to help people grow it, to place something practical in their hands, something that could nourish families, restore dignity, and begin to change what daily life looked like. Looking back, this moment feels small, but also huge, because it carried the seed of everything that would grow from it. Then in 2013, we were invited by Chief Nkosi Makpamulo to farm his land and work with his community in Itchetlope. The invitation was simple: teach people how to grow food. What began as planting a field became something much larger. It became a 3-year Canadian food grains project, and for the first time, we stepped into working on a field scale. We planted 1/2 hectare of maize. Up until this point, much of our learning had been small gardens, small training plots, but this was different. This was also a land that had history. It had been worked and was carrying the effects of those years. It was also land that had been cultivated by people with beliefs steeped in the veneration and consultation of ancestral spirits. The superstition and fear was heavy. But now in that space, something began to change. Bathed in prayer and planted in alignment with God's good creation, the maize grew strong, deep green, tall and healthy in a way that really got people's attention. You could see the difference, not in theory, but in actuality in the field. This was one of the first times that we saw at scale that when the land is treated differently, it responds differently. And it was not just about the crop. It began to shift what people believed was possible.
Not everything goes according to our plan. Our friend and co-worker stands here with his family in his garden in Bechuandle. He was one of the first people that we invested in, hoping that he would become a Farming God's Way trainer. He was energetic, engaging, deeply involved in the work. At first, he seemed like exactly the kind of person that we wanted to invest in that could carry this much forward through the Zulu communities. He implemented what he learned, and he gathered people around him. We had many fun moments together. But over time, we began to notice something that wasn't quite right. His garden, for example, didn't reflect the standards that he was teaching. There was a gap between what he was saying and what he was living. And there was a sense also, difficult to name at first, that he was hiding. And tension began to grow between he and us. He had unrealistic salary expectations, conversations towards us became more strained, and eventually, when his expectations were not being met, he walked away, but not quietly. He left taking with him a laptop from the organization and 2 cell phones. This was a very painful moment for us, not just because of what he'd taken, but because of what this represented. We had believed in him. We'd invested time and energy, trust and hope, and suddenly it felt like everything was unraveling. But this moment enabled us to confront something very important. This work is not just about technique and methodology, what to do on the land. It's not just about teaching methods. It's about integrity and what's happening in the heart. It's about alignment, what's lived, not just what's being said.
And then this is Tolakele. She was one of the first people in Icheklope to take what she had learned and implement it in her own garden at her own house. She worked with her own hands in her soil, and the results were remarkable. Her maize grew tall and strong. It was so healthy that, again, it stood out to neighbors. But it was more than a crop, because for the first time, Tolakele had more than she needed, even enough to begin feeding her chickens, and enough to begin thinking differently about what was possible. This image has stayed with us for years because it captures something we had been hoping for: transformation that is owned, transformation that is lived out beyond the training space. Even through challenges, this was a glimpse of what could be. But it raised a deeper question for us: how do you replicate this? How do you move from one story like this to many? Because at the same time, requests for training were increasing, communities were asking, and we just could not do it all ourselves. So the question shifted: not just how do we grow food and good crops and run good trainings, but how do we grow people who can carry this much farther than we could ever do?
In July 2017, we traveled to Ethiopia, where we were invited to train 300 Bible school teachers from the Kalahewit Church. The vision was to equip pastors and teachers to grow food for their families, because the reality was that their salaries or income from the churches nearby weren't enough to help them weren't enough to provide for their families. Many pastors were living in poverty. These teachers were living in poverty, struggling to provide even basic food for their families. So this was not just about agriculture, it was about dignity, sustainability for the churches, for the schools, and a way forward for them. But what struck us most was how quickly the message that we had, the good news that we brought, took hold. There was a pastor that we'll never forget. He was a pastor and a teacher at a Bible school.
Right there, that picture. Sorry, go back. That man right up there, yeah.
During the training, in the middle of one of the sessions that I was teaching, he got up and went outside, and I thought at the time, I wonder what's going on there, right in the middle of the session. But he went outside, we found out later, to make a phone call to his son, who was out plowing the fields. So he ran out and called his son to tell him to stop plowing. There wasn't any delay. He didn't need any more persuasion, discussion, or information. Right then, something had shifted for him. He'd learned enough to know that what he had been doing for all these years wasn't working. Well, he already knew that it wasn't working, but now he understood part of the reason why it wasn't working, and that something different was possible, and he wanted the change to start right then. That training in Ethiopia enlarged our vision. And at the same time, another vision was taking place in us, and it was a dream of establishing a training farm in South Africa, a place where leaders could come and see and experience, walk through the gardens and experience the abundance that comes when we care for creation as God had intended from the beginning, as God taught Adam in Eden. And it would be a place where understanding could take root deeply, spiritually and agronomically. We began to realize that if we could strengthen the training of leaders in South Africa, the impact would not just stay there on the farm or within that community, it would flow outward to many places, to places like Ethiopia and beyond.
So then in 2018, we began to consider how the dream of the model farm could become a reality. It would be a place where people could come and experience and learn, a place where the land itself would tell a story. At times, we worried that the dream sounded completely unrealistic, maybe even a little bit crazy. But a small group of people, and especially within the Evangelical Missionary Church of Canada, within this denomination, they took the vision and it resonated deeply with them. They began to connect us with others, including churches, communities, and people who could see what we were seeing, and slowly the vision became shared. In January 2019, we registered Inando Development as a not-for-profit charitable trust in South Africa. In May 2019, we were led to a piece of land in the Assegai Valley, not far from Durban. At first, it seemed like the ideal place, but that opportunity fell through. And then, almost unexpectedly, we found ourselves on the other side of the same valley, on another piece of land. There were 3 hectares with a much-loved home and lots of unused space. It was an unformed blank slate.
And that's it there.
That's part of the view. In September, that property at 19 Cadmore Road would become the Inando Model Farm. And at that stage, there was nothing to show. There were no training gardens, no training structures. There was no evidence of our dream. But there was a house that we could live in and some land, plus the soil, the sun, the rain, all of the organic material, all that we would begin to steward. We nurtured a growing sense that something could happen here. This was where we would begin to shape the land into something that could be experienced, something that could help people believe that restoration is possible.
So here's the same land 5 years later. As you can see, it's no longer empty. People are praying together here in the field at the end of a 5-day training that we had just held. The maize is nearly ready for harvest. The soil is regaining fertility. The vegetable gardens are thriving. In just 5 years, the land has been shaped and it's begun to shape others. We've seen leaders emerge and the Inando staff also grow, not just in skill, but in confidence and in responsibility, in faith, in obedience to Christ. People have taken what they've learned here and they've carried it to their own communities. Food has been produced here, real, nutritious, nutrient-dense organic food that has moved beyond this space into homes and into the community. But perhaps the most significant impact is a little harder to measure. It's what happens when people stand in a place like this and they see and experience what is possible. When they walk through rows of healthy crops, when they touch the soil and sense the power of the Creator, and when they begin to imagine that what they see and experience there can happen where they live. The Inando space has become much more than a farm. It's become a place where understanding is birthed, where faith takes root and grows, and where people move from wondering if this could be possible to seeing for themselves that it is. And once something like this has been seen, the transformation begins to resonate outward.
So everything was thriving and moving forward in May of 2024. We had just hosted a training with a team from Canada. The farm was alive and functioning and strong in ways we had only hoped for back in 2019. It felt like a high point. And then on June 3rd, 2024, the weather changed. There was something unusual in the air that afternoon, and around 4:30 p.m., the wind increased sharply, and then the rain came. But not in the way that we were used to. The wind was so strong that the rain was moving sideways, horizontally, and unrelentingly. And in only a few minutes, everything was over, with this eerie stillness that followed, and this sulfur yellow glow in the sky. And as we began to look around, we saw trees down everywhere. Our driveway was blocked by 3 large trees that had blown over, plus 6 of our 10 avocado trees had been completely uprooted with their roots exposed and shredded. All the trees were lying on their side. We felt such loss at the devastation. Could any of these trees be saved? We called experts who told us the avocados would not survive. But one arborist said something different. If we could get them back into the ground within 24 hours and cut off the entire leaf canopy, there was a chance. So we tried. In the middle of everything else that needed attention, we replanted these 35-year-old avocado trees. We put compost around their bases, covered the tree lines with a thick mulch cover, and we kept them watered 3 times a week. And then we continued on with the rest of the farm recovery. It was a full 5 weeks of clearing, rebuilding, putting things back together. It felt like a lot to come back from. But slowly, something began to happen. After about 6 months, we could see new life emerging from the old avocado trunks. Tiny little buds. The trees were responding with hundreds of new buds on their short trunks. And then 2 years later, just a couple of months ago, we began harvesting avocados again. Yeah. God miraculously restored each one of the 6 avocado trees. These miraculous moments stay with us because it reminds us of something we have been learning all along. Even when everything looks lost, restoration is still possible, but it takes time, it takes care, and it takes faith in the God of restoration. And when it does happen, it carries a quiet kind of hope, the kind that says loss is not always the end of the story.
This past November, now at the end of our 15th year teaching Farming God's Way, we led a training in Cambodia, as we mentioned earlier. Cambodia, Ethiopia. So we gathered in a church with 20 people sent from 5 surrounding churches. At the beginning of every Farming God's Way training, we hoped that what is learned in the training would not stay there, but would move outward through the churches into homes, into fields and communities. So we prayed that these 20 leaders would be the beginning of a hope-filled movement in northern Ethiopia. As for one of the attendees, it was exactly that. The farmer that we talked about earlier in our introduction had a life-changing experience at this training. He'd been struggling in his field for years, noticing that no matter what he did, the yields were declining. He told his story to one of the trainers, and we heard it a little bit later, that over time, this farmer and leader had come to believe not only that his land was cursed, but that he himself was somehow cursed. And to him, farming itself, the activity of farming was a curse. But during the training, something shifted in his understanding. Hope emerged, and he began to believe something very different about his identity. The farmer realized that what he was experiencing was not because of a curse from his forefathers or the ancestral spirits, but instead the crop failures were the result of the mindset and methods that he had learned and that he'd been using. And when that understanding took hold, everything changed, and the emotional weight that he'd been carrying lifted. You could actually see the transformation in his body, in his face, and the way that he carried himself. He left this training and returned to his fields filled with hope and with joy for the first time in years. He'd received the skills to work in partnership, the skills and the knowledge, the mindset of how to work in partnership with God and his very good creation to restore the fertility of the soil and greatly increase his yields. He also embraced a deeper understanding of God's love for him and how that's connected to a tangible provision of food from the land. This is the transformation that happens when truth is seen clearly and received. In Joel 2, after years of loss and confusion, of desperation, there was a promise that what had been lost would be restored, that the story would not end in despair. And sometimes that restoration begins with a simple but profound realization. I'm not cursed. God loves me, and he's made a way for me and my family. And from that place, people begin again with a completely different perspective and expectation.
Then, just 5 days after returning from Ethiopia, this would be the beginning of December last year, we took possession of a second Inando property just across the road. We now operate on Inando Rise and Inando Riverside, which is a total of 6 hectares or 16 acres of land. It turns out there was a reason why Inando needed to be on this side of the Asagai Valley, because across the road from Inando Rise, another 3-hectare property existed with a huge green barn, a structure that could be used for training large groups. Plus, there was more land for cultivation and training areas. This new opportunity at Inando Riverside was completely unexpected. And the purchase of the additional property was made possible through the generosity of a donor. We had been planning to build at Inando Rise, the first property, in order to have better training facilities. Our trainings were consistently oversubscribed, and we were turning people away who were hungry to learn because we were limited by the space, by the weather, by the infrastructure. But now we didn't have to build. Inando Riverside had the needed infrastructure right across the road. It was a second home and a place prepared specifically for us to accomplish God's mission. This is our 16th image, reflecting our journey over 16 years. I hope you don't mind if we add a few supporting images to deepen the significance of this latest chapter in our story. So this past March, we were able to train in the Green Hub for the first time. I think go to the next, there we go. Yeah, that's the big green shed. It's got a big green roof, that's why we call it the Green Hub. 70 people gathered with plenty of space to sit, to interact, and to learn well. Toilets were close by, as was a small room that could serve as a kitchen. These are simple things, but they changed everything. It felt almost unreal. After years of working with the limitations of weather and training in tents, this barn felt like abundance. And as we stood there, we had such a strong sense that this is what we had been moving toward, a place that can receive many more people, a place that can form many more leaders, and a place where resilience can grow and a movement can be sustained. 16 years have led to this, a farm and a movement where all we have learned and experienced does not stay contained, but begins to pour out. This is Inando. Inando is more than a location. It's a movement towards fullness, toward a future where more and more people can grow food until they are full. We are part of a holistic message which is advancing the kingdom for the glory of the King.
This is the call that we've accepted to spend ourselves on behalf of those who are struggling, to bring good news to those in despair, to feed the hungry through equipping them for flourishing, to see families not just surviving, but thriving, to imagine a future where communities across Africa are no longer at the mercy of drought cycles, and where resilience is growing in the soil and in the people. This movement will not be built by us alone. This story, in a very real way, is your story. You're part of this story. And this story will be carried forward by leaders in Africa and beyond who are emerging from this work. Leaders by Stu Zile, our Inando Development Coordinator, who is right now leading this week. She's got a major meeting this week. She's leading a small group strategy across the Durban area. While we're here fundraising and reporting and speaking at churches and so on and so forth, she's keeping the momentum alive. 25 small group leaders are being formed through this strategy. They're growing in confidence walking in their own communities. And on the next slide is Andile, who's part of our staff team at Anundo. He's continuing to work the land and steward the farm, caring for the properties, maintaining what's been built, growing food on the model farm, and mentoring others in the process. And 9 leaders in Ethiopia are forming a Farming God's Way leadership structure for the nation of Ethiopia for the purpose of reaching every community with the transformative, faith-centered agricultural teaching. Leaders like Solomon and Elias are embracing a holistic vision for their country, a vision which is not just about growing crops, but growing people and growing communities. This is how it spreads, often quietly, always faithfully, from one person to another. And this is where it connects back to the promise that we began with in Joel chapter 2, this vision of restoration, not just of land, but restoration of nations, not just for one season, but for all the years that were lost. Until there's enough, until dignity is restored, until people are full. This is the journey that we're on, to show that farming is a blessing, to help people transform what feels like cursed land to a land of prosperity, of abundance, and to raise up kingdom leaders in food production and creation care. And we are profoundly grateful for your involvement with us on this journey. Amen.